Most men don't grow up. They just become harder to read. The voice gets deeper, the face stiffens, the body learns to hold tension without flinching, but the fear remains unchanged. He's still the boy who needed to earn affection, still the boy who turned silence into safety, still the boy who mistook performance for worth. Now he calls it discipline. Now the world calls it maturity. But Schopenhauer called it something else, something far more disturbing. Stay until the end of this video, because what you think is strength might be something you were never allowed to outgrow. We mistake stability for growth, but what most people call maturity is just a well-practiced defense. A man isn't praised for being whole. He's praised for being useful, composed, unshaken. So he adapts, not into someone he is, but into someone the world will leave alone. He cuts away the softness. He edits himself for approval. He performs control instead of confronting fear. And because that performance is rewarded, it never gets questioned. He's told he's strong for hiding pain. He's told he's wise for suppressing emotion. He's told he's a leader for enduring what others express. So he builds his identity around what he can tolerate, not what he needs. And he becomes proud of that, not because it fulfills him, but because it protects him from needing anyone else. By 30, he's reliable. By 40, he's unreachable. By 50, no one remembers who he was before the mask. And yet the boy is still there, not gone, just buried under competence, under repetition, under the exhausting performance of having it all together. This is why Schopenhauer didn't trust surface-level virtue. He saw that most men weren't living from wholeness. They were living from injury that hardened too early. And the longer it goes unexamined, the more sacred it becomes. Eventually, even suffering gets moralized. The man doesn't just hide his pain. He wears it like it means something. He thinks the endurance itself is proof of growth. But Schopenhauer was clear. That's not growth. That's preservation. And the only reason the mask feels real is because it started forming before you had words to question it. Which is exactly where we go next, because Schopenhauer didn't believe we develop from clarity. He believed we develop from pain. Schopenhauer didn't believe that pain was a detour in development. He believed it was development, not in some poetic sense, but in the structural psychological reality of how we form identity. He argued that suffering isn't something we pass through. It's something we build around. When we're young, we don't have the tools to process fear, shame, or abandonment. So we adapt by creating patterns that help us survive. We make ourselves more agreeable, more invisible, more pleasing, or more aggressive, more withdrawn, more in control. Each adaptation becomes a response to suffering. Each response becomes a role, and that role becomes the emotional blueprint for who we later call ourselves. This is why some men obsess over success, not because they love winning, but because they still believe approval might undo the wound that caused the hunger. Why some men detach from emotion, not because they're above it, but because they once showed it and got punished. Why some men take pride in being useful, not because it fulfills them, but because being needed felt safer than being rejected. Schopenhauer wasn't a therapist, but he saw that most men don't choose who they are. They inherit it, constructed around the point where life hurt too soon and no one noticed. That's what makes these patterns dangerous. They don't feel like protection anymore. They feel like personality. They're no longer responses to suffering. They're stories we tell about our worth. And by the time we feel the cost of them, we've already mistaken them for principles. But these principles weren't formed through wisdom. They were formed through threat, which means they aren't moral, they're mechanical. And that's what Schopenhauer feared most, that we would spend our entire lives defending a version of ourselves that was never whole to begin with. So the question becomes, what happens when these patterns start to look noble? What happens when we moralize our avoidance? That's where we go next. Not every defense looks like fear. Some look like values. By the time a man reaches adulthood, he's rehearsed his protective behaviors so thoroughly they no longer feel like reactions. They feel like wisdom. They feel like strength. They feel like identity. But Schopenhauer understood the danger of unexamined virtue. Because once a survival pattern is moralized, it becomes untouchable. The man who shut down emotionally to avoid abandonment now calls it stoicism. The man who buried his desires to keep the peace now calls it selflessness. The man who learned to earn love by staying useful now calls it purpose. None of these things are wrong in isolation, but when they form around unprocessed fear, they stop being choices. They become compulsions dressed as character, and the world affirms them. The workplace rewards reliability. Relationships reward containment. Society rewards detachment in men as long as they stay functional. So these defenses get locked in. They become sacred, not because they're true, but because they've been useful long enough to be called noble. This is where the fracture deepens, because now any attempt to challenge the pattern feels like a betrayal of who you've become. Now being honest feels disloyal to the image. Now breaking the pattern means confronting the very thing that made you feel safe in the first place. So you don't break it, you double down on it. You protect the behavior, then rationalize the consequences. And before long, you're not just surviving through the pattern, you're preaching it. You give others the same advice that kept you hidden. You shame vulnerability in men who haven't yet abandoned themselves. You call your scars proof of insight, your silence proof of mastery. But none of it was chosen. It was absorbed, and now it's moralized, which means it's almost impossible to see. But once identity becomes a defense, it can no longer evolve. It can only harden. And eventually, it breaks, just not where you expect it to. Because the man doesn't collapse in crisis. He collapses the moment the image starts to feel real. What that means, most people never see coming. The collapse doesn't happen in the moment of failure. It happens in the moment of self-assurance. When the image you've been protecting finally feels complete. When the world reflects it back to you, you think you've arrived. But what you've really done is lock the door behind you. Because the more convincing the adult becomes, the more unreachable the child remains. The man doesn't evolve from the boy. He organizes around him. He builds structure where the fear used to be. He builds performance where the need once lived. He builds conviction where the silence first formed. And then he reinforces it. Every day, every decision, every relationship. Not by checking in with who he is, but by doubling down on who he thinks he has to be. He doesn't say, "I'm afraid." He says, "I'm focused." He doesn't say, "I don't know how to receive love." He says, "I don't need anyone." He doesn't say, "I'm exhausted from being strong for everyone." He says, "I have responsibilities," and no one questions it. Not his family, not his partner, not even him, because it's clean, it's functional. It fits the image of what a man is supposed to be. But that image didn't come from self-awareness. It came from necessity. And Schopenhauer's fear was that most men would never realize they've simply upgraded the same defense, layered it in achievement, covered it in philosophy, and renamed it character. What was once survival is now seen as principle. What was once repression is now called discipline. What was once abandonment is now framed as independence. But the core hasn't changed. And here's the fracture. The more successful the man becomes, the less likely he is to examine what that success is built on. Because the more the world rewards the mask, the more dangerous it feels to take it off. But eventually, something doesn't align, not publicly, internally. The roles don't relieve him like they used to. The relationships don't reach him. The praise doesn't land. And for the first time, he can't tell if the life he's built is protecting him from pain or protecting him from himself. But even here, the story doesn't break. It just evolves into something harder to spot. That next version is even more convincing because it sounds like healing. When the mask starts to slip, most men don't confront what's underneath. They just reach for a better mask, one that feels introspective, self-aware, elevated. They call it healing, but healing, when used to bypass the wound, becomes just another layer of avoidance. This is the trap Schopenhauer anticipated. He saw that most men, when faced with the discomfort of truth, wouldn't regress. They'd intellectualize. They'd read books about ego death instead of grieving the self they abandoned. They'd memorize quotes about detachment instead of feeling what they're still afraid to need. They'd spiritualize their numbness, moralize their loneliness, and rationalize their emotional paralysis as enlightenment. And it works. It buys time, and it even looks admirable from the outside. Because who questions the man quoting Marcus Aurelius, journaling about stillness or meditating on impermanence? No one. Which is why it's so effective. The man gets to feel like he's growing while avoiding the one thing growth actually demands: confrontation. Not with the world, not with society, with the child version of himself that he still refuses to meet without judgment, so his language evolves. But his fear doesn't. He can describe trauma with precision, but still lives inside its structure. He can outline boundaries, but still abandons himself to be chosen. He can talk about the inner child, but only in third person. And this is the final defense, the belief that understanding the wound is the same as healing it. But it isn't, because insight without grief is just control. It doesn't change anything. It just gives the illusion that something is changing. And once the illusion becomes identity, the man starts calling his mask truth. But the cost of that illusion doesn't show up in theory. It shows up in the relationships he can't enter, the intimacy he avoids, and the chaos he keeps attracting. And eventually, it catches up with him, just not in the way he expects. Eventually, the avoidance starts to feel like clarity. He's no longer just explaining his patterns. He's defending them. Not out loud, not in arguments, but silently through pride. He's proud of how little he needs, proud of how much he can handle, proud of how emotionally composed he remains when others fall apart. And this pride becomes armor, because it proves that he's not fragile, that he's learned, that he's risen above the chaos that once defined him. But Schopenhauer would have called this something else. He would have called it the second illusion. The belief that emotional restriction is evidence of transformation. It isn't. It's just performance with better vocabulary. Wisdom, when it's built on unexamined defense, becomes indistinguishable from fear. But now it wears robes. Now it speaks in philosophical terms. Now it can quote every thinker who ever rationalized distance as strength. And the more accurate the language becomes, the more invisible the wound it conceals. The man isn't avoiding himself anymore. He's curating himself. He's become a museum of well-framed insights, arranged to keep visitors at a distance. But no amount of self-awareness can restore what was never grieved. Because grief doesn't speak in ideas. It speaks in interruption. And until that interruption is allowed to happen, without intellectual control, wisdom will remain a disguise, not a truth. Not because the man is lying, but because his pain is speaking in the voice of principle. And once that happens, the man no longer knows where he ends and the wound begins. That's where we go next, because what Schopenhauer feared wasn't suffering itself. It was how easily suffering becomes your philosophy. Schopenhauer didn't preach healing. He didn't offer closure. He didn't romanticize suffering or promise that understanding it would set you free. He warned that most people, especially men, would mistake the structure of their suffering for the structure of reality. That once a man builds his life around an early wound, he stops seeing it as a wound. He sees it as wisdom, as identity, as truth. And from there, he doesn't just protect it, he defends it. He builds relationships that validate it. He chooses ideologies that echo it. He seeks out experiences that reinforce it. But none of this is conscious, it's reflex. The kind of reflex that started when he was too young to name what he felt. So he built a personality around what wouldn't get punished. And by the time that personality is fully formed, it becomes unrecognizable as defense. It becomes sacred. This is the man who moralizes his pain, who teaches others to suppress themselves and calls it strength, who passes on the very tools of repression that were handed to him, believing he's passing on wisdom. But there's no awakening in this. There's just repetition. And repetition isn't growth, it's preservation of the wound, of the story, of the image that was never questioned because it looked like virtue. This is what Schopenhauer feared. Not the presence of pain, but the way pain becomes a framework, then a belief system, then a life. And once that happens, the man doesn't know how to stop it, because he doesn't feel trapped. He feels right. But the body always knows what the mind refuses to name. And when the cycle finally begins to break, it's not clarity that arrives first. It's disorientation. It doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like restlessness, like distance in your closest relationships, like disconnection in moments that used to feel safe. Something feels off, but not loud enough to name, just enough to unsettle. This is where the cycle begins to crack, not from the outside, but from within. Because even if you've moralized your pain, even if you've buried the boy so deep beneath discipline that no one can find him, your body still remembers the truth. It shows up in the tension you can't release, in the silence you carry into every room, in the way you work until there's nothing left but exhaustion, because exhaustion doesn't ask questions. And this is where the repetition starts to make itself known. You lose intimacy the same way every time. You sabotage peace when it finally arrives. You shrink or explode in moments where confrontation could have created connection. It's not fate, it's pattern. And it doesn't matter how much philosophy you know. If you haven't made the unconscious conscious, as Jung would say, you will continue to live it. And you will call it destiny. This is what Schopenhauer quietly feared. Not just that men would suffer, but that they'd organize their entire lives around that suffering and never recognize it as optional. Because once a man believes his emotional survival strategy is truth, he stops evolving. He just repeats himself with different jobs, different partners, different outcomes that all lead back to the same emotional state. But he won't question it because it feels earned. And anything that feels earned is almost impossible to let go. But there's a deeper fracture beneath all of this, one that men avoid their entire lives. And it's not about pain, it's about authorship. That's what we confront in the final section. You weren't born with beliefs, you built them under pressure, not by asking who you are, but by learning what parts of you were safe to show, what emotions didn't get punished, what behaviors made people stay, and over time that became your character, not because it was true, but because it was tolerated. This is why most men can't answer the question, who would you be without the pain that shaped you? Because we rarely outgrow our suffering. We just give it cleaner names. We call it purpose. We call it discipline. We call it being a man. But at some point, you have to ask, did you choose your beliefs? Or did the boy who needed to survive choose them for you? Because if you never went back to meet him, you're still carrying his fear, still following his rules, still living the version of you that made the most sense to a child who didn't feel safe. And maybe that version kept you alive, but it won't bring you peace. It can't. Because a life built around fear, no matter how refined, is still a life that was never authored. So the question isn't whether you've grown, it's whether you've ever stopped protecting the version of you that had to be built to survive. And if not, who's really living your life?